He was just digging under his house while the neighbors laughed. But one night changed everything. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation, and write in the comments what city you're watching from. The northern edge of Michigan at the beginning of the 20th century was not a place people chose out of comfort. It was chosen out of necessity, out of failed hopes elsewhere, or because there was nowhere left to go. Once the iron veins in the hills had been drained dry and the mining companies pulled out, the towns that had grown up around them were left behind like old scaffolding. After a building had been torn down, what remained were scattered houses pressed into the earth, lean and barren with warped doors, and roads that were more mud than gravel for most of the year. In winter, the land did not merely grow cold, it turned hostile, as if the earth itself were offended by human presence and set out to erase every sign of it. With snow and wind, Lake Superior lay far to the north, but its influence was felt here in the heavy dampness that crept into walls and bones alike. Snow did not fall gently in this country. It was driven sideways by winds that scoured skin raw, and when the storms came, they stayed for days, sometimes weeks, burying fences, swallowing trails, and leaving men disoriented 10 steps from their own doors. Every old-timer in the region carried stories of neighbors who had vanished between barn and house, of children found frozen stiff behind drifts that looked harmless until you tried to cross them. The land Elias Rivers owned was the sort most men avoided. It lay in a shallow depression where the soil was dense clay, packed with stone hard as iron when frozen and sticky as glue when wet. Spring floods pooled there and left behind a sour dampness that never quite went away. The road that passed his property was a thin ribbon of dirt that washed out each April and turned into a frozen trench by December. The nearest store was 5 miles away, and the nearest neighbor nearly a mile in the opposite direction, across a stretch of scrub forest that howled like a living thing. His house was small, a single-story box with a low-pitched roof that sagged slightly in the middle, built long before Elias arrived and already old when he bought it for a price so low that people in town whispered it had to be cursed. The boards were warped, the windows never sealed completely, and no amount of tar or cloth ever quite stopped the wind from finding its way inside. On the worst nights, Elias lay awake listening to the walls creak and the stove sigh, and wondered whether the building would finally give up before morning. He was a man of middle years when he came north, carrying everything he owned in a borrowed wagon and a stubbornness that had been beaten into him by decades of disappointment. His father had been born to a generation that tasted freedom but never safety, and his grandfather had been a builder of secret places when secrecy meant survival. From them, Elias had learned to trust his hands more than words and his instincts more than promises. The North did not scare him, not in the way it scared newcomers, but it tested him in ways the South never had. Here, there were no grounds to disappear into, no relatives within a day's walk, no church that looked like home. There was only work, silence, and a community that watched him from a distance, measuring him without ever inviting him close. Money was always thin. The small garden he carved out of the clay gave him potatoes and beans when the weather was kind, and the odd job hauling wood or mending fences kept him afloat when it was not. But everything broke eventually in that climate. Hinges froze, doors swelled, roofs sagged under ice. Elias spent more time repairing than improving, and more than once he found himself choosing between food and lumber, between patching the leak and buying corn. There was a heaviness to his evenings that had nothing to do with the cold. After supper, he often sat at the rough kitchen table, lamp burning low to save oil, listening to the wind and thinking about the people he had lost and the places he no longer belonged. It was on one such evening, digging through the bottom of an old trunk in search of a missing tool, that he uncovered the notebooks his grandfather had once kept hidden beneath false boards in a barn far away and long ago. The leather covers were cracked, the pages yellowed and stained, but the ink was still legible. Elias had not seen them since he was a boy, and holding them again felt like touching a voice from another life. They were filled with diagrams and cramped handwriting, instructions written in the language of practice rather than theory. There were sketches of chambers dug beneath cabins, of narrow air shafts hidden behind chimneys, of trapdoors so well fitted that even the builder forgot their edges after a few years. In the margins were notes about temperature, about how deep the frost reached and how the earth below held to a steadier warmth, no matter how cruel the air became. His grandfather had not been a man who talked for the pleasure of it. Every lesson had been born from necessity. Every technique from the knowledge that discovery meant capture and capture meant death. Those rooms were not only shelters for men, but from weather places, where families waited out both hunters and blizzards, where the difference between life and death was measured in inches of soil and the strength of a single beam. Elias read long into the night, the lamp guttering, the wind battering the house. He thought of the winter before, of waking to ice crusting the inside of his walls, of the way his breath had clouded the air even beside the stove. He remembered a neighbor who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite hauling water from a well, only 30 yards from his door. He remembered the sound of the roof shifting under snow and the sudden certainty that one day it would not hold. Outside, the town that barely qualified as one carried on with its routines. There was a small church that filled on Sundays, a general store where men gathered to trade news, a sawmill that groaned through the short summer and fell silent as soon as winter made Hull impossible. The people were not unkind in the way of raised fists or shouted slurs. Their hostility was quieter, carried in the way I slid away when Elias approached and how conversations paused. When he entered a room, he was tolerated, not welcomed, and he understood that there were lines drawn in this place that he was not meant to cross. The reason became clearer when he learned, through a passing remark at the store, that a timber company was buying up land along the river. A new road was planned, a spur to carry logs south, and the map someone had pinned behind the counter showed his small, miserable patch of ground sitting squarely in the path of progress. The man leading the purchases was well known, a figure whose money spoke louder than any argument. It was said he wanted clean lines and no complications, that he paid well at first and fought hard when he was refused. Elias did not think much of it until the offer came to his door in the form of a polite letter that praised his property in language no one had ever used for it before. He read it twice and set it aside, the words sinking in slowly into his thoughts. Sell now and leave before the next winter. It suggested without saying so outright before the land that already tried to kill you finishes the job. That night, lying in bed with the notebooks spread open beside him, Elias felt the past and present aligned in a way he had not expected. He thought of the low crawl spaces beneath old cabins, always warmer than the rooms above. He thought of the way frost never quite reached the same depths in the garden. He thought of his grandfather's cramped writing, of the diagrams that had once saved lives no one ever recorded in any ledger. When the stove crackled and the wind rattled the panes, the idea did not arrive with a trumpet blast or a single moment of revelation. It settled into Elias Rivers like cold settling into the joint, slow and relentless, until he could no longer imagine his life without it. For days after finding his grandfather's notebooks, he walked the house, measuring with his eyes, noting the way the floor dipped near the back wall, how the beams were spaced, where the stovepipe ran and where it did not. He began to see not just the room he lived in, but the invisible space beneath it, the dark volume of earth that had always been there, holding its steady temperature while he fought the weather above. On the first morning of October, he took a pry bar and carefully lifted the loose plank nearest the rear corner of the house. He worked with a slowness that bordered on reverence, easing the old nails free so they would not bend, laying each board aside in the order it had been placed decades earlier. When he was done, there was a rectangle of bare dirt where his floor had been, the clay beneath packed so tight it looked more like stone than soil. The first strike of the shovel sent a shock up his arms. The blade barely bit into the ground and rang like iron on iron. He tried again, angling the edge, leaning his weight into it. But the earth gave only grudgingly. It was not the friendly loam of his childhood gardens, it was glacial clay, ancient and stubborn, and it would not be hurried. By noon, his shoulders burned and his palms throbbed, but the hole was scarcely deeper than a man's hand. He filled the first bucket and carried it through the narrow doorway, dumping the clay in a small pile behind the house. The sight of it startled him. There was no hiding what he had begun. Dirt had to go somewhere, and every bucket was a declaration that something strange was happening on his land. By the end of the first week, the rectangle had become a pit deep enough to stand in. The work carved its way into his life until it was all he did. He rose before dawn, dug until the light faded, ate standing up, then went back to the hole with a lantern to steal another hour from the night. His hands blistered and then hardened, the skin splitting only to be layered over by new calluses. He learned to bind his palms with strips torn from an old shirt and to work through the ache. That followed him into sleep. It was impossible to keep the secret. The pile of dirt grew like a cairn marking some private madness, and people noticed. They passed more slowly on the road, turning their heads to peer at the house. At the store, voices lowered when he entered. Someone laughed behind him one afternoon, a short, sharp sound that was swallowed before he could turn to see who made it. By the second week, the story had taken on a life of its own. He was digging a cellar that would flood. He was burying treasure. He had finally lost his mind. A boy from the next farm wandered up one evening under the pretense of returning a borrowed hammer and stared openly at the hole in the floor. The word grave made its way back to Elias through a man who had never spoken to him directly. He let it pass. He had no energy to spend on arguments. The first letter from the timber company arrived on the 12th day, delivered by a rider who did not dismount. It spoke of opportunity and transition, of a fair price and the wisdom of moving on while the chance was there. Elias read it in the lamplight and felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. He folded the paper carefully and slid it into the trunk with his grandfather's notebooks. The work grew more dangerous as the hole deepened. The clay held for a time and then, without warning, a section would slump inward, burying his shovel and forcing him to claw the dirt free with his hands. Once, he was inside the pit when it happened and only managed to scramble clear by sheer instinct, his heart hammering as he stood in the half-collapsed cavity and imagined what would have happened if he had been a step slower. After that, he began bracing the sides with boards salvaged from an old shed, wedging them in place and checking them before every descent. The rumors did not abate. Someone left a dead crow nailed to a fence post near the road, a gesture that had no clear meaning, but felt like a warning all the same. He found his tools shifted one morning, not stolen, but moved just enough to let him know someone had been there. It hardened something in him. If he had ever considered stopping, the thought no longer surfaced. The pit had reached a depth where climbing now required effort, where he could no longer see the sky without craning his neck. To quit now would be to leave a wound in his own floor and a story in every mouth in town. The second letter was less polite. It arrived folded inside a newspaper, the type blurred as if the writer did not trust even the mail. It suggested inspections and zoning issues, hinted that his deed might not be as solid as he believed. Elias felt his jaw tighten as he read. He had seen this kind of pressure before in other places, the way men with money could lean on those without until the world tilted. He burned the letter in the stove and went back to digging. By the time the pit reached his chest, the idea of secrecy became less about pride and more about survival. He began covering the opening at night, replacing the boards so that from above the room looked as it always had. He carried some of the dirt farther from the house, scattering it at the edge of the woods so that the pile would not draw so much attention. He learned to listen for footsteps on the road, to pause when a wagon creaked past. The sound of the shovel suddenly too loud in the quiet afternoons. On the 20th day, he stood at the bottom of the pit and realized he had crossed a line he could not retreat from. The hole was now taller than he was. The clay pressed in around him, the air cool and still compared to the drafty room above. The notebooks lay open on the table behind him. A page turned down at a diagram of brickwork and airflow. He wiped the sweat from his brow and felt, for the first time since he had begun, something like certainty. If the North wanted to bury him, he would meet it on its own terms. Once Elias Rivers reached the depth where the walls of the pit rose above his head, the act of digging ceased to be only a physical struggle and became something closer to an act of faith. Every descent into that narrow shaft carried with it the understanding that the earth could decide at any moment to reclaim the space he had stolen from it. He worked with the quiet intensity of a man who had accepted the risk because the alternative felt worse. The notebooks of his grandfather were no longer just relics of a past he missed. They became his blueprint. He spread them across the kitchen table each night, tracing the faded lines with his finger, reading the tight handwriting until the words blurred together. The notes were not gentle. They spoke in the language of mistakes that had once cost lives. They warned of chambers that collapsed when men were too impatient, of air that turned poisonous when a single vent was misjudged, of fires that consumed shelter instead of preserving it. From those pages, he learned the simple truth that the earth's warmth was not magic but mathematics. Below a certain depth, the temperature stopped following the moods of the sky and settled into a narrow band that barely shifted through the year. The trick was to reach that depth without undermining the structure above, to carve out a space that would not betray itself when winter came with its weight of snow and ice. He began to draw his own plans in the margins, adding measurements taken from the house itself. The room would have to fit beneath the existing beams far enough from the foundation that a collapse above would not crush it, but close enough that he could reach it quickly if the storm arrived faster than expected. He calculated the width so that he could turn with a bundle of wood in his arms, the length so that a small iron stove could sit against the far wall with shelves rising beside it. He sketched the route of a vent that would sneak upward through the wall cavity and emerge disguised behind the old brick chimney, indistinguishable from any other breath the house exhaled. The greatest challenge was invisibility. His grandfather had written of trapdoors that saved families not only from weather, but from men who searched by habit and expectation. A door that looked like a door was no door at all. Elias studied the grain of his floorboards, the way each had warped over time, the pattern of nail heads that only he ever noticed. He resolved to cut his opening so that when the boards were replaced, the seams would fall where they already existed. The new wood would be aged and stained to match the old until even he had to search for the edges. The project demanded resources he did not have in abundance. Brick was not cheap in a place where everything had to be hauled in from miles away, and he needed hundreds of them. He salvaged what he could from a collapsed chimney on an abandoned property, carrying the cracked remnants back in his cart and scrubbing the old mortar from them with a wire brush until his arms ached. When that supply ran out, he spent what little money he had saved at the brickyard in town, loading the fresh red blocks by hand and feeling each coin leave his pocket like a cut. Transporting them back along the muddy road was its own ordeal. The wheels sank into ruts, the cart threatened to tip, and more than once he found himself alone on the roadside, resetting the fallen load while the sky darkened with the promise of early snow. Each brick he stacked in the corner of his kitchen felt heavier than its weight, not because of the clay it was made from, but because of what it represented. If he failed now, there would be no money left to hide the failure. The timberman did not remain silent. Word reached Elias through a neighbor who could not meet his eyes that inspectors were asking questions about property lines, that someone had been seen studying maps in the store with a frown on his face. Another letter arrived, this one terse and formal, warning of irregularities in his deed that could be resolved amicably if he was willing to discuss a transfer of ownership. Elias read it twice and folded it away with the others. The pit was now deep enough that he could stand at the bottom and feel the temperature change against his skin, cool and constant. And he knew he was already beyond retreat. He began laying the foundation for the walls before winter closed in completely. The clay at the bottom of the pit was tamped flat and covered with a thin layer of gravel scavenged from the road, a crude attempt at drainage in a place where water had a way of finding every weakness. The first row of bricks took him an entire afternoon. He worked slowly, checking each with a level he had borrowed and not yet returned, mixing mortar in a battered tin until it reached the consistency described in the notes. The smell of lime filled the pit and stung his eyes, but he welcomed it as proof that the project had entered a new phase. Each night, he climbed back into the house with his clothes streaked white and red, the evidence of his labor clinging to him. He noticed that people were watching more openly now. A man he had never spoken to crossed the road. Rather than pass the house one evening, his gaze fixed on the ground. Another time, Elias found boot prints in the dirt pile where someone had climbed it for a better look. He began covering the pit during the day when he went to town, replacing the boards and scattering a thin layer of dust over them so that no fresh-cut lines would shine. The walls rose a few inches at a time, a careful geometry in a space that felt too small to contain the dream he had for it. He reinforced the corners with extra mortar, conscious of the way the pressure of the surrounding earth would seek out the weakest points. He wedged beams above the growing brickwork to take some of the load, following diagrams that showed how weight could be coaxed away from a cavity if it was given the right path. There were moments when doubt crept in, usually late at night when the wind pressed hard against the windows and the stove gave more smoke than heat. He would sit at the table and imagine the walls collapsing, the bricks crashing into the clay, the money and sweat swallowed as if they had never existed. It was during those moments that he returned to his grandfather's words, to the small, cramped lines that spoke of men who had survived because they trusted the earth to hold them when nothing else would. By the time the first real frost silvered the grass, Elias Rivers was no longer digging a hole in his floor. He was building a room beneath his life, one brick at a time, in quiet defiance of a world that had never given him reason to expect mercy. By the time November settled fully over the Northwoods, Elias Rivers no longer thought of the pit beneath his floor as a hole. It had become a room in his mind, a place with shape and purpose, and that change in perception carried him through the grimmest weeks of labor he had ever known. The clay walls that once pressed inward like the sides of a grave were now hidden behind courses of brick, their red faces rising against the brown earth, rising steadily toward the underside of the floor. The bottom of the chamber was the first part he allowed himself to perfect. He spent 2 days tamping the earth flat, then another morning spreading a thin bed of gravel he had collected a bucket at a time from a dry stretch of road where the stones were cleanest. It was not true drainage, not the kind an engineer would recommend, but it was enough to break the direct path of moisture from soil to floor. When he stood back at last, lamp held high, the bottom of the room looked less like a pit and more like a foundation. He worked the first rows of brick with the care of a man handling glass. Each brick was buttered with mortar, set, tapped, checked, then checked again. He corrected small deviations before they became fatal flaws, scraping away wet mortar and resetting bricks when the line wandered even a hair's breadth. The notebooks lay open on a crate beside him, the page held down by a stone so that the breeze from the vent pipe did not turn it. His grandfather's neat drawings of corner joints and load pots became almost a voice in his head, guiding his hands. As the walls grew, the chamber began to take on an identity separate from the house above. The air down there was different, cooler, but steadier, a hint of the promise he was chasing. He learned to read the sound of his own movements in that space, the way footsteps echoed softly rather than ringing, the way the clay absorbed noise that would have carried in the wooden room above. It was as if the earth itself were already learning to keep his secrets. Safety became an obsession. Every 4 courses, he stopped to drive temporary braces into the clay behind the brickwork, then boards salvaged from a collapsed shed wedged tight to support the wall until the mortar cured. He crawled into the narrow space between brick and soil with a trowel to fill gaps he could not see from the front, emerging with hair and clothes smeared gray and eyes stinging from dust. More than once, he paused with his heart racing, convinced he had heard the groan of shifting ground, only to realize it was the house settling under the first game of snow on the roof. The installation of the stove was a turning point. It was a small iron box he had traded for 2 weeks' worth of firewood. Its legs uneven and its door warped from years of use. But to Elias it looked like the heart of the room. He set it on a platform of flat stones and brick to isolate it from the floor, then worked out the route of the flue according to the diagram. That showed how to carry smoke upward without advertising its source. The pipe rose from the stove and disappeared into a cavity he had carved behind the brickwork, angling through the wall and into the hollow beside the chimney above. From outside the house, nothing changed. Smoke would still drift from the same place it always had, and no one would suspect that its source lay beneath their feet. Ventilation was trickier. Too little air and the room would become a coffin of its own making. Too much and it would bleed heat faster than he could replace it. He cut a narrow shaft that ran at an angle away from the chamber, surfacing in a thicket behind the house, where it could be disguised as nothing more than a knot hole in a rotten stump. He tested the flow with a candle flame, watching the tip bend gently toward the opening, and made small adjustments until the draw felt right. All the while, the pressure from the timberman tightened. Elias returned from town one afternoon to find a stranger standing by his fence, boots sunk in the mud, studying the house with open curiosity. The man nodded once and walked away without a word. Later that week, another letter arrived, this one bearing the tone of an ultimatum couched in language about safety and compliance. Elias did not reply. He could not afford distraction. Every brick had to be perfect, every joint had to hold. The trapdoor consumed nearly a week of careful work. He cut the boards so that the grain ran unbroken across the opening, aged the new wood with salt and vinegar until it matched the surrounding floor, and fitted the hinges in such a way that the door could be lifted from beneath, without leaving any sign from above. When he finished, he stood in the main room and stared at the floor until his eyes blurred. Even knowing exactly where to look, he had to crouch and run his fingers along the seams to find the edges. By the time the first real snowstorm dusted the fields, Elias Rivers had stocked the chamber with shelves of jars and sacks, stacked firewood in the corner, and laid a thin mattress against the far wall. He descended the ladder one evening, closed the trapdoor above his head, and lit the stove for the first time. The flame caught and grew steady, and as the heat spread through the brick, he felt a quiet thrill that was almost fear. For the first time, he was not merely hoping, he was proving. The North did not announce winter with ceremony. It crept forward day by day, stealing small mercies first until Elias Rivers could no longer remember what it felt like to wake without stiffness in his fingers or to step outside without bracing himself for pain. The first hard frosts came in early November, a brittle sheen on every blade of grass. Then the nights when the water bucket froze solid in the kitchen if he forgot to bring it in. He took those signs as confirmation that his work had not come a moment too soon. Yet it was not the cold alone that unsettled him. There was a change in the way the land behaved, subtle at first and then unmistakable. The birds vanished from the hedgerows weeks earlier than usual, their morning chatter replaced by a silence that pressed against the ears. His neighbor's horse began to shy at nothing, refusing to cross the low ground near the river, its breath steaming wildly as if it sensed a predator no one could see. Even the wind had taken on a different quality, sharper, laden with the dry snow that fell like powdered glass and stung any exposed skin. Elias watched these signs with the wary attention of someone who had survived. By noticing what others dismissed, he tested the door to the winter room each night, lifting it from below and closing it again, timing himself, making sure he could seal it without letting more than a breath of cold into the chamber. He reinforced the ladder, adding an extra brace so that it would hold not only his weight, but that of someone weaker, someone who might need to be lowered rather than climb. The timberman's presence hovered at the edge of his thoughts. The final offer arrived one gray afternoon, delivered by a boy who looked relieved to be rid of it. The letter was brief, the language stripped of politeness. There would be no more delays. Land would change hands by agreement or by decree. Elias folded it with the others, a collection of threats, and slid it back into the trunk. Whatever happened in spring would have to wait. Winter was coming for all of them, and Winter did not respect contracts. He spent the last mile days tightening every loose end. He wrapped the vent opening in fine mesh to keep out drifting snow, then built a small hood of scrap tin over it, angled so that the wind would scour it clean rather than pack it full. He added a second shelf for food, spreading his stores so that if one jar broke, he would not lose everything. He tested the stove at its lowest burn, learning the rhythm of the damper, how to coax a steady warmth from the smallest flame. The first serious storm struck without warning. It was not the great blizzard he would later remember, but it was enough to drive him down into the winter room for an entire day. He sat there with the lamp lit and the stove murmuring softly, listening to the wind batter the house above, and marveled at the difference. The chamber held at a temperature that felt almost gentle compared to the bitter room upstairs. When he climbed back out the next morning, he carried with him a certainty that he had never known before. He had built something that could outlast the sky. The days that followed were a long, uneasy vigil. The cold deepened, then eased, then returned with greater force, a series of finds that seemed designed to lull the careless into complacency. Elias did not allow himself that luxury. He rose each morning with the sense that he was standing at the edge of a cliff, peering into a fog that hid both danger and reprieve. He noted the way the clouds hung low and heavy over the tree line, the way the air pressed against his sinuses as if the world were drawing in a long breath. On the eve of the storm that would change everything, the signs were impossible to ignore. The temperature fell 20 degrees in a single afternoon. The sky took on a metallic hue, a dull reflection that made the snow glow faintly even before it began to fall. The wind dropped to nothing at sunset, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt staged. Elias stood on his porch and listened to that stillness with his heart in his throat. He had felt it before years ago. In another place, the calm that comes when the atmosphere is finished arranging itself for violence. He went inside and lit the stove in the winter room one last time before the descent. He did not rush. He packed a small bag with extra socks and his grandfather's notebooks, then paused at the threshold between the room he had lived in and the one he hoped would save him. For a moment, he wondered how many men had stood in similar crossroads, trusting in holes in the ground and the knowledge passed down through generations, when the world above had become uninhabitable. When he closed the trap door over his head that night, he did so with the quiet conviction that he might not open it again for days. The storm did not arrive as storms usually did, with a gradual darkening of the sky, or the soft beginning of falling snow. It came as if a door had been thrown open somewhere in the north, and all the violence stored behind it released at once. Elias Rivers was already in the winter room when the first gust struck the house above him. He heard it through the layers of wood and brick, a deep shudder that rolled through the beams and into the walls around him. The lamp flickered. Dust sifted down from the ceiling in a fine gray veil. For a moment, he thought of climbing back up, of checking the roof or the chimney near the windows. But the second gust came harder, accompanied by a sound like the tearing of canvas. And he knew the decision had already been made for him. The trap door stayed closed. The storm was now the master of everything that lay above. Within minutes, the world beyond the brick walls ceased to exist as anything recognizable. Wind screamed down the vent shaft with a voice so fierce it seemed almost alive. Not in a single direction, but many, circling and colliding, searching for weaknesses in the house Elias had spent his life repairing. The temperature in the chamber dipped slightly as the system adjusted, the brick drawing in the cold from the sudden influx of air, but it steadied quickly. He fed the stove a single stick of wood and watched the flame bloom. Comforted by its stubborn persistence, time lost its familiar shape. The hours that followed were not marked by clocks or daylight, but by sound. There was the thunder of falling trees in the distance, a hollow booming that echoed through the earth itself. There was the crack of something large giving way, perhaps a barn, or a section of roof, the noise distorted by the storm until it could have been anything at all. Once, he heard what might have been a scream, thin and distant, and he pressed his palms against his ears. until the sound vanished. He had expected solitude, perhaps even relief in being hidden away while the world tore itself apart. What he had not expected was the knocking. At first, it was so faint he thought it part of the storm, a random rhythm in the chaos above. Then it came again, more insistent, a pattern that no wind could produce. He stood from his stool and climbed the ladder, placing his ear against the underside of the trap door. He held his breath and listened. The knocking returned, followed by a sound that was not quite a voice, but close enough to freeze him where he stood. He opened the door only a fraction, just enough to see the blur of white beyond, and was met by a blast of cold that stole his breath. A figure fell forward through the opening, collapsing at his feet in a tangle of limbs and snow. It was a man he recognized only vaguely, a farmhand from down the road, his face a mask of ice and exhaustion, his hands wry and bleeding. Elias dragged him down into the chamber and slammed the door shut, sealing out the storm with a finality that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. The man could not speak at first. He shook violently, teeth chattering so hard Elias feared they would break. Elias stripped off his own coat and wrapped it around the stranger, sat him beside the stove, and fed the fire more generously than he had allowed himself before. It took several minutes before the trembling eased enough for the man to form words. His family's house had lost its roof. They had tried to reach the nearest neighbor and lost the trail within yards. He had been wandering blind when he saw smoke, real smoke, not the pale ghost most chimneys produced in that cold. He had followed it as if it were a beacon. They had barely settled him when the knocking came again, louder now, frantic. Elias did not hesitate. He threw the door open and was met by a wall of white so thick he could not tell where the sky ended and the ground began. Shapes moved within it, resolving slowly into people bent against the wind. A woman with a child clutched to her chest, another child half dragging a younger sibling, whose boots had frozen to their feet, a man whose beard was rimed with ice, so thick it looked like stone. They came down the ladder one by one, Elias bracing them as they slipped, hauling them into the chamber and closing the door again as quickly as he could. Snow followed them in a thin layer on the steps, but the room swallowed it, the warmth turning it into water that soaked into the gravel floor rather than lingering. More came. The chamber that had been designed for one man filled with bodies with breath and fear, and the unmistakable scent of wet wool. People pressed against the brick walls, sat on the floor, leaned against shelves that groaned under the weight of unintended company. Elias counted without meaning to, a habit born of his careful preparations, and reached 9 before he lost track. The storm did not abate. It howled with a persistence that defied exhaustion, as if the air itself had been wounded and could not stop crying out. Inside, the challenges multiplied. The air grew thick despite the vent, heavy with moisture from melting snow and human breath. Elias adjusted the damper, risking a touch of cold for the sake of oxygen, then watched anxiously as the flame responded. He rationed the food without ceremony, breaking hard bread into smaller pieces, passing jars down the line and trusting the others to take no more than they needed. Sleep came in fragments. People dozed upright, heads lolling onto shoulders that belonged to strangers. Children whimpered in their dreams, the sound cutting through the low murmur of the storm like a blade's edge. The man who had arrived first, now thawed and lucid, wept silently with his face in his hands, his grief as loud in the small room as any scream. At some point during what must have been the second night, the chamber filled with smoke. It seeped from the stove in lazy coils that clung to the ceiling and drifted downward, turning the lamplight into a hazy smear. Elias felt panic claw at his chest, the knowledge that the system he had trusted was failing at the worst possible moment. He climbed the ladder and cracked the door just enough to clear the pipe, his fingers numb in seconds as he scraped ice from the hidden vent path with a length of wire. He closed the door again and slid down the rungs, coughing, the room a chorus of rasping breaths behind him. Slowly, the air cleared. Slowly, the fear ebbed. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to their struggle. Inside, 9 lives balanced on the edge of a design drawn by a man long dead and brought into being by a man who had refused to leave. When at last the wind began to falter, no one trusted it. The silence that followed was too abrupt, too complete. Elias waited hours before he dared approach the door again, listening for the return of the howl. The trick of calm that sometimes preceded a second assault. Only when the quiet persisted did he climb the ladder and press his palm against the wood, feeling not the knife of cold he had expected, but a muted chill that hinted at an end. He lifted the door and let the light fall in. The light that spilled through the open trap door did not resemble morning, as Elias Rivers remembered it. It was too sharp, too white, stripped of the gentle transitions that usually accompany dawn. He climbed the ladder cautiously, feeling the wood beneath his boots flex in unfamiliar ways. And when he pushed his head above the floor, he felt as if he had stepped into another world. Snow surrounded the house in sculpted walls that reached higher than the windows, smooth and gleaming, shaped by the wind into curves that looked deliberate rather than chaotic. The porch was gone, erased beneath a frozen wave, and the road that had once led past his gate was indistinguishable from the fields beyond it. Behind him, the others followed one by one, emerging into the glare with the hesitancy of people who had been hidden too long. Children shielded their eyes. Adults stood in stunned silence, their breath pluming into the blue air. The man who had been the first to reach Elias's door dropped to his knees on the warped floorboards, pressing his forehead to the wood as if to assure himself that it was real. The house had suffered, but not surrendered. A section of the roof had caved inward under the weight of snow, and the windows had burst, leaving their frames rimed with ice. Yet the trapdoor lay open and unobstructed, the wind having scoured it clean while burying everything else. Elias stared at that narrow rectangle in the floor of the unlikely gateway. That had kept 9 lives intact and felt an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with cold. They fanned out across the varied landscape, calling names into the stillness, listening for any answer that might rise from beneath the drifts. Elias moved with them, though he did not speak, his eyes taking in the way familiar shapes had been reduced to anonymous mounds. A barn lay folded in on itself like a broken insect, its beams splintered, the bodies of cattle frozen where they had stood. Doors were blocked by snow packed so tightly it had to be hacked away with axes. In one yard, a woman was found curled against a fence, her arms wrapped around herself, the gesture of survival preserved in ice. In another, a man lay half within his own doorway, his hand reaching toward the warmth that had been only steps away. The count of the dead came slowly, each name a blow that left the town quieter than before. 23 lives were confirmed lost, and there were still those unaccounted for, the missing whose absence hung heavier than any certainty. Grief filled every space the wind had cleared, its presence as tangible as the drifts. 2 days after the storm, the timber man arrived. His coat was still fine, his boots polished, and he looked like a figure misplaced in a ruin. His own house stood intact, a stark contrast to the devastation around it, but his barns had collapsed, his livestock lost, his profits erased in a single night. When he learned that 9 people had survived beneath Elias's floor, something brittle broke across his face. He found Elias in the yard, hauling boards from the wreckage, and spoke with a fury that seemed to need an audience, of responsibility, of warnings that should have been given, of how a man who saved himself should have saved the town. The words were sharp and loud, and for a moment Elias felt again the old isolation, the sense of being weighed, and found wanting in a place that had never quite accepted him. But he did not answer with anger. He told what he could without adornment. He had prepared, he had opened his door, he had not turned anyone away. The timber man's voice rose in response, but it did not find the ground it needed. The people who had survived in the winter room moved closer, forming an unspoken line between the accuser and the accused. They did not shout. They spoke names. They spoke of children who were alive because a hole in the ground had been waiting. They spoke of breaths still being drawn in lungs that should have frozen. Their gratitude did not beg for understanding, it simply existed, undeniable. The confrontation ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The timber man turned away, his authority diminished by a force he could neither command nor purchase. The crowd dispersed slowly, the work of survival calling them back to the broken pieces of their lives. Elias did not rest. He moved from house to house, tending stoves, helping dig out doorways, lifting beams where others lacked the strength. He shared food until his shelves were nearly bare, trusting that the winter room had been built not as a fortress, but as a bridge between need and hope. At night, he returned alone to the chamber, now quiet and empty, and listened to the echoes of voices that still seemed to cling to the brick. The storm had ended, but its story was only beginning to be told. Spring did not arrive in the North Woods with celebration. It came slowly, in grudging increments, as if the land itself were unsure whether it was safe to soften again. The snow withdrew a few inches at a time, revealing the wreckage the storm had hidden and then covering it again in slush. When the nights froze, for Elias Rivers and the others, those weeks were a season of labor more exhausting than the blizzard itself. Survival had been only the first act. Rebuilding demanded something deeper. Then endurance demanded belief. People began to come to his house almost as soon as the roads became passable, first out of curiosity, then with intent. They stood in his doorway awkwardly, hats in hand, asking questions they would never have voiced a month earlier. Elias showed them the trap door without ceremony, lifting it so they could peer into the brick-lined chamber beneath the scarred floor. He did not embellish the story of the storm or of those days underground. He pointed to the walls, the stove, the vent, and spoke only of what had worked and what had nearly failed. The idea spread faster than he could have imagined. Men who had never laid a brick before began to dig beneath their kitchens and barns, measuring depths with borrowed tape and marking vent paths in chalk on rough lumber. Elias found himself moving from property to property, explaining the principles he had learned from his grandfather and refined through fear. He insisted on certain details, on the importance of depth, on the invisible trap door, on the need for vents that would not choke under snow. He simplified where he could, knowing that not everyone had the patience or the tools he had possessed. His winter room had been a proof of concept. Now it had to become a pattern others could follow. The timber man did not disappear, but his presence changed. He attempted to resume his purchases quietly, sending intermediaries to sound out those who had lost the most in the storm. The offers were met with caution he had not expected. People who had once measured their worth in acreage now measured it in safety. When he eventually began digging beneath his own barn, claiming it was for the animals, Elias could not help but notice how large the chamber grew, how its proportions suggested shelter for more than cattle. He said nothing. Some acknowledgments were not spoken aloud, as summer warmed the clay and made digging easier. The sound of shovels became a constant across the valley. The earth was opened in dozens of places, each pit a declaration that the next winter would not find them as unprepared. Elias began to keep notes of his own, not with the cramped secrecy of his grandfather's journals, but with the clarity of someone who knew the words would be shared. He wrote of mistakes made, of vents that iced over and had to be rerouted, of floors that sagged when beams were too widely spaced. He turned his experience into guidance, not theory, but instruction born of a room that had held when everything else failed. The change in his own life was subtle at first. He noticed that people no longer averted their eyes when they passed him on the road. Children waved. The storekeeper set aside supplies he thought Elias might need without being asked. His house, once a symbol of isolation, became a point of reference, a place people mentioned when giving directions, as if it were a landmark rather than a curiosity. The winter room remained as it had been on the night it saved them. Elias resisted the urge to enlarge it, to turn it into something more comfortable. It was enough as it was a reminder of the line between necessity and excess. When he descended into it alone, he did so not out of fear but out of respect, touching the brick with the same reverence he once reserved for the pages of his grandfather's notebooks. By the time the first hints of autumn returned, the valley had changed Chimneys still smoked, fences were still mended with whatever lay at hand. But beneath many of the floors now lay rooms no one would have imagined a year before. The land that had tried to kill them had been answered in kind, not with defiance, but with understanding. Elias stood one evening at the edge of his property, watching the sun set behind the trees, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle into him. He had not sought to be a leader. He had only wanted to live. Yet in carving a space beneath his own life, he had given others a way to remain where they were, to refuse the steady erosion that had driven so many away. The storm that had taken so much from them would never be forgotten, but it would no longer be the only story they told. In the seasons to come, when the first flakes of snow drifted down and the wind began to rise, families would look to the hidden doors in their floors and remember the man who had trusted the earth to hold him when the sky could not. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters and the other hidden stories waiting to be told. Watch the following videos to see what else was uncovered in places no one thought to look. And share this video with someone who loves real survival stories.